In spite of my extremely youthful appearance, and thank you for agreeing with me on that, I've actually been around a while. I first stepped into a classroom as a teacher in the 1960s. Now, speaking with my children about the 1960s, one might as well be speaking about something in the 17th century. So I've seen a bit. I've seen the good and the bad, the highs and the lows. I've been fortunate enough to move across from schools to universities, back to schools, and indeed to see what's happening in a lot of countries. I've been quite privileged that way. In terms of the highs and lows, my experience over the years has been that you don't tend to see it all in one place at the same time. If things are going well in one country, they're perhaps not going so well in another. And then a few years later, it'll all be different. I have to say, and I apologise for starting with something bleak, but I do unapologetically start with something bleak so that we can move to the positive and the optimistic. I have to say that I have never experienced things at such a low ebb in so many places. Almost universally, we have problems with student engagement, what's sometimes called unruly behaviour, certainly disengagement with academic learning, which shows in a lot of results. And even more worrying in a way, for someone who's spent so long in and around the teaching trade, teachers wanting out in a way I've never experienced before. And teacher education recruitment in so many places at a low ebb as well, and that's a perfect storm for a crisis. And that's the way things in Australia, frankly, are being talked about, even at government level now. For a long time, things have been not going well, but it's been very difficult to get government people to acknowledge it. That's finally starting to happen. In Australian terms, it's rather tragic for me, I have to say. Particularly tragic because in the first decade of this century, things were going well across all of the measures. Teacher retention was very high. Teacher education recruitment was extremely high. I remember as a Dean of Education in around 2005-06, boasting that any of the students who were taken in that year, and the numbers were high, could have done engineering. That's just fallen away completely over the last 15, 20 years. What's the difference? What was happening in the first half, the first decade of the 21st century that's changed in the second decade? Well, I'm slow to simplify things. I mean, it is a different world and there's all sorts of new challenges now that weren't there just 20 or so years ago. But it is interesting to me, and I can't help but make the connection, that in the first decade of the 21st century, Australian education was pushing heavily down a values-based approach. We had hundreds of schools engaged by about 2009, and the estimation was that another 5 years we'd pretty much have every school in the country, public, private, religious, engaged in a values-based pedagogy, as we called it. And then around 2010, different government, different minister, and we started chasing very explicitly the international test scores on PISA. That became pretty much the be-all and end-all, and a regime was set in place internally to aim for those. The great irony is, of course, that the minute that started, we started to slip in the international test scores. We were actually doing very well without making it the be-all and end-all, and there's a lesson there. we were well in the top quartile of the OECD countries. We were 4 or 5 across most of the measures. We're now down 19, 20. We've slipped horribly. And the more government has pushed that agenda and everything that goes with it, the endless testing and measuring, what we call classically trying to fatten the pig by weighing it more often, stupidity, I say without apology, the worse we've done. When our country started to turn in that direction, when I could see government moving in that direction, I felt like somebody watching a child putting a screwdriver into a PowerPoint. You just want to scream, don't do it. Because the history of education is littered with that sort of stupidity. It never works. And it kills good teaching, and it kills the teaching profession. And that's quite bluntly what we're seeing now. And this isn't just me talking. Nope, it's the middle one, okay. Better research heads than me have addressed this problem. Just last year, the Grattan Institute, a very highly respected research group in Australia, looked at the problem in Australian schooling, everything I've talked about. Low student engagement, low retention rates of teachers, teacher education becoming an unpopular thing. It was a very extensive piece of research, and it looked at every nook and cranny. It didn't simplify. When it summarised its findings, it was all around the nature of teachers' work. It said one of the real problems is that we're asking teachers to do the wrong things. We're training them to one job, and then we're expecting them to do a different kind of a job. And a lot of that was about the unnecessary administrative tasks to do with chasing basic literacy and numeracy results, chasing the got-all international test results. It really was killing teachers' work. We've got to do something about that, Grattan said. And it finished with an impassioned plea. Let teachers teach. Train them to do the job and then let them get on and do it. The way we train doctors and then let them get on and do their job, and dentists and engineers and architects. But somehow or other with teachers, we've made the big mistake of training them to do one job and then expecting them to do another job, a job that frankly doesn't require the skills of teaching and in fact can kill good teaching. It finally called the report Making Time for Great Teaching. You don't have to read too much into it to see the irony, tongue-in-cheek almost. We're not making time for great teaching, we're making time for all sorts of other things, and we've got to get back to great teaching. So what is great teaching? Well, it's certainly not trying to fatten the pig by weighing it more often. That really is the silliest thing that anyone can do, and yet it happens. Andreas Schleicher, the OECD education expert, who himself has been a great critic of what's happened in Australian education, he knows education probably better than anyone across the world. He knows Australian education very well because he's spent some time there over a lot of years. Very, very critical, suggesting that what's happened in the last decade is that instead of helping students to think, we're threatening to turn them into robots. That's the effect of the endless teaching and testing and measuring kind of regime. He says the domains of great teaching are actually holistic. We've got to concentrate on that. This is where teachers' work should be directed. At human knowledge, obviously across the disciplines, the key learning areas. But we need to ensure that our students, our pupils, learn to be politically astute and engage in civic life in an informed and meaningful way, especially important to a democracy. We need to teach them how to be healthy human beings in every sense, physically, mentally, economically even. We need to engage the creative brain because that puts the brain in different space that's essential to effective learning. And we need to teach them about ethics and judgment so that they can be morally informed citizens as well as anything else. And to me, Schleicher's holism reflects very much the way we were going about the values education program in the first decade of the century, with particular focus obviously on that last one, taking a leaf out of some of the greatest minds that have ever put their mind to education over centuries, over millennia, that at the end of the day, all effective education is moral education. You're probably not familiar with it, so I'll just run through some of the details very quickly. All the findings, by the way, are still on that website, almost 1,000 pages of data. It's actually the largest program of its kind ever done anywhere in the world, and there's plenty of papers that have been written that make precisely that point. It's interesting that the findings do persist on a government website, even though government for the last 12 years or so has steelily ignored them. Began in 2003 with a pilot study. 70 schools were given 2 terms, half a year, to implement a values education intervention. There had been interest in the UNESCO program, and particularly how the UNESCO program was having effect in some of the world's toughest spots. This is where I came in. I was not, as an aside, a values-based educator. It wasn't my thing at all. I was a curriculum person. That was the job I got at Newcastle almost 40 years ago. And for the first 20 years of my academic career, that's what I taught in teacher education. I wrote books on it, I gave papers on it, etc., etc. As you know, the curriculum part of teacher education, unlike some parts of it, is a fairly practical area. It's something that any good teacher needs to have the skills of. You can go into a classroom without knowing everything about Piaget's developmental theory. You can't go into a classroom and be effective if you don't know how to manage curriculum, how to set up lessons and implement them and evaluate them, etc., etc. So I was sort of what was often called the what works person. I never took greater delight than when a student teacher would come back from prac and say, you know what you were doing there, that really works, that was great, that was really helpful. Wonderful. So it was with those eyes of a curriculum, what's working here kind of person, that I was drawn into reading and evaluating the report from the pilot study, the values education study, and recommending to government whether there was something working here and whether it was worth going on with. And there clearly was, even from that very early report. And so then I became involved, and that's the story of my next 20 years. I was involved in the very consultative process that came to be the national framework. Most consultative thing I've ever been part of educationally. Every school in the country, every student, every teacher, every parent was invited to be part of a process of putting together an effective values education program. You know, starting with the key values. What are the values that are, you know, regardless of any kind of consideration of ethnicity or gender or indigeneity or anything else that you believe characterise what Australia should be and what your school should be standing for. It was a long process, it took about 18 months. By the time that was formed, we moved into the Good Practice Project, as it's called, a 4-year study with hundreds of schools involved. Then in 2009, a testing and measuring study evaluating the whole thing, particularly putting the research blowtorch to all the claims. Do these claims that are being made stand up to research scrutiny? And then a trailing off little action research project. It wasn't meant to be the end of it. We were encouraged to put in for 6 years' worth of funding that would have quadrupled the sample, if not indeed consumed every school in the country. And then all of a sudden things changed. And we had a government that was going down the path of sticking screwdrivers into PowerPoints. There were almost 400 schools across all age groups and sectors involved, about 110,000 students, about 5,000 teachers, and just 51 university researchers, apart from my own little coordinating team. Why 51? Because all of the schools engaged in the projects were broken up into 51 clusters, schools of 4, 9, 11. Schools normally geographically proximate, not always. Normally within one or other system, not always. Normally primary or secondary, but not always. We had mixtures of all sorts. Some of the most interesting clusters actually were where things were very mixed across all sorts of indicators. And each of those clusters had a university researcher attached as a coordinator, mentor, played various roles, but above all, responsible for writing and or endorsing the final report that came from the cluster that made up the almost 1,000 pages of data. And the key job for the university researcher was, again, to make sure that the claims being made were what we'd call evidential by some indicator, quantitative, qualitative, etc., etc. We wanted things to be assured so that we could push the case that this is not only a way, but we wanted to suggest the way in which everything should happen in schools, in classes. This was the pedagogy that would work best of all. And we believed we had the evidence for that. To cut to the chase, there were, and we're talking about student effect, there were 3 clear effects that came through when factor analysed. 1 I call predictable, 2 a little less predictable, and 3 a bit surprising. And they look like this. 1 was an enhanced values consciousness. That is more talk of values, explicit language about caring, trusting, respecting, tolerance, kindness, gratitude, etc., responsibility. The language was there. The signs were coming up on school gates. Our school's values are blah, blah, blah. But also the demonstration was there. We had the evidence that schools really were becoming more like that. It wasn't just talk. Well, I say predictable because that's exactly what the study was all about. If we hadn't achieved that, then it was a dismal failure. What was a little less predictable was the ease with which the social and emotional wellbeing data kind of fell out. I mean, you look back and you say, of course, that was predictable. If you have a more values-filled kind of environment, well, people are going to be happier, aren't they, surely? But at the time, it wasn't, front and centre of our mind's eye. Surprising, at least at first, and I noticed this even evaluating the pilot study, how easy talk of and demonstration of academic improvement started to fall out as well. Talk of students being more engaged with their learning, better discussions, teachers actually pushing the edges of their pedagogy a bit more because the students were more engaged. They were pushing them towards, deeper learning, if you like. And as the project just rolled out over 4 or 5 years, those indicators became so apparent. Now again, it seems a little naive even now to say, well, that was surprising. Only surprising if you don't get the connection between the values-filled learning environment, people feeling happier to be there, and their learning improving. Bit silly, I mean, surely that's going to happen. But again, there were other studies that were focused on things like academic achievement. It wasn't really ipso facto what we were there to do. It just happened. And there's such a lesson there for those responsible for education in that. And again, it makes even greater stupidity of the notion of running education along the lines of kids sticking screwdrivers into PowerPoints. Just mining a bit of the data. This is the sort of language that you'd find in the 1,000 pages or so. Under the values consciousness, much more talk of respect and focus and harmony, mutual acceptance, and the corollary reduction in behaviour-related referrals. We have endless papers that have used this data to say, isn't it interesting? This was not a behaviour management program, and yet they seem to achieve the goals of behaviour management programs better than the average behaviour management program. What a lesson there. Under number 2, the calmer environment, less conflictual, people feeling supported, teachers and students feeling much more supported, happier to be there, protected against negative behaviours like bullying. We have a paper that was written to say this was not an anti-bullying program, but again, it achieved the goals of anti-bullying programs better than most anti-bullying programs. And against academic improvement, I go straight to probably one of the most research-assured paragraphs in the whole 1,000 pages. It's from the executive summary of the evaluation report. Yes, there are measurable improvements, quantitative and qualitative, in students' academic diligence, including things like greater attentiveness, working independently, more cooperatively, care and effort being invested in their work. Those are the kinds of factors that come through in those studies that focus on academic achievement. Pretty obviously, you don't get academic achievement if you don't have those sorts of things in place. It was not what we saw ourselves doing, and yet it just happened. What a lesson. And this one that I love, it's one little paragraph I've broken up to make the point. It sort of sums it all up. By creating the environment where values were constantly shaping everything really, from the learning environment, the atmosphere, the ambience as we called it, all the way through to the ways in which the curriculum was being unpicked, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Number 2, teachers and students are happier, the school's a calmer place to be. Number 3, student learning improves. I've often said that learning and loving are both complex, nuanced, highly nuanced human activities. They're not things done well and effectively by barging through the front door. If I was to say to you, right, the objective here is that you're going to love me, and I'm going to test you every week to make sure you're loving me more, what do you reckon's going to happen? And learning is not all that different. You've got to go around the back. You've got to slip in through the kitchen window sometimes to get the effect that you want. Why? We'll just dance through this, a very quick little history lesson, just to make the point that the wisdom about all of this has been with us almost from the beginning of our civilization, which makes it even more remarkable that we forget it so easily, and even more remarkable in an era in which brain science is endorsing so much of the wisdom. Pythagoras, we all know from the hypotenuse. He was a maths nerd if ever there was one. He believed that the world was just one big mathematical puzzle and the gods were super mathematicians, and if you could teach people mathematics, then, they'd become more godly. He was a bit of a nutter that way, but he learnt a thing or two. about teaching. And one of the things he learnt comes to us from Antisthenes, Socrates' pupil, where he said, it's stupidity to expect that a pupil in an uncongenial environment faced with mind-dulling learning would achieve anything worthwhile. What they need is a supportive environment and a meaningful curriculum, a rich, meaningful curriculum. This is 2,500 years ago. And in terms of the rich, meaningful curriculum, well, his Pythagorean academies were characterised by, yes, study of mathematics, because that's really all he was interested in, but a holistic curriculum, including a lot of theatre and play and dance and things like that. And nature studies, getting pupils out into the real world, breathing the fresh air, teaching them about the shared DNA. Ghazali, the Persian medievalist, there's two things that really matter to good education: kindness towards the pupil and eliciting imaginative wonder. Fits rather with Gavin's notion of inspire as the first goal. Vasily Sukhomlinsky, the Ukrainian educator in the Soviet era. What's important are each student's comfort and instilling imaginative wonder through multidisciplinary learning and the study of nature. I come then to modern brain science, which endorses the wisdom of all of that and the thing that we forget too easily. Dasha Narvaz, who's a wonderful neuroscientist who's also an early childhood educator, she says imagination's the key. One might say inspiring is the key to unlocking the emotions that facilitate human reasoning of the best kind. Human reasoning of the best kind is the kind of cognition we want to achieve anything worthwhile in schools. What role for education, he says in this? Well, imagination's not spontaneous. It needs two things: an environment that's safe and caring, where people feel secure and supported and encouraged, and a variegated, imaginative-oriented curriculum with teachers unpicking the meaning behind the content, not just the facts and figures for next week's exam, but what's the relevance of this for you? Basically saying everything that Pythagoras said 2,500 years ago. So what did we say in implementing values pedagogy? The implicit side of it was establishing the values-rich learning environment where the students' safety and support and encouragement and care, etc., was the absolute priority. And the explicit focusing on the values component of the curriculum, not just the easily measurable stuff that we get too distracted by. But what's the value of this? Why are we studying the French Revolution? Why are we studying this chemical theorem? Why are we studying Pythagoras' theorem? Because it's in the why that we instill positive imagination. And I've come across recently work by a fellow called Dasha Keltner from Berkeley. He's a neuropsychologist who talks a lot about awe. It reminds me again a little bit of the notion of inspire and certainly of imagination. He says what we should be doing is focusing on awe, establishing awe, the awe that goes with, oh, I'm feeling safe, I'm secure, and I'm in a comfortable environment, I'm surrounded by kindness. And the awe that goes with the excitement of learning, seeing the relevance of it, wanting to learn more. That's where we establish the lifelong learner. He says it's awe that releases the self. gets the self out of the self to see the self in relation to other people, other life, the planet, the universe. And that's really what we want to achieve for the fullness of efficacious learning and certainly lifelong learning. Just a little more of the data and that ultimate student effect that I repeat. By creating this kind of environment where values are sort of pushing everything in a certain direction, then, we create the well-being environment and the place where true academic learning can happen. But not because we make it the be-all and end-all, not because we barge through the front door, because we've learnt how to get around people. We know that learning is a nuanced thing. This is the hope, I suppose, for me. The hope is that things like this are happening, and that even in Australia, finally, after 12 years or something of sticking screwdrivers into PowerPoints, we finally have a government that's acknowledging the problem and looking again at some of this data that's being sitting, getting rather dry on their own website. Thanks very much.